You might remember a couple months ago on Oklahoma Gardening when Brenda planted our stellar geranium garden. Now these geraniums are really special to us. They have beautiful patterns on the foliage, the flowers were gorgeous, and we sited them under our trellis. We had hanging baskets with a trellis in the background to give them some afternoon shadows to keep them cool. We were looking forward to wonderful flowers all summer long. But you know where they ended up? They're in the compost bin, and let me show you these. It seemed like they got off to a good start, but they just never did thrive. And you may have had flowers do the same thing around your yard, or maybe even vegetables or fruit, and you can't quite figure out what's wrong with them. Take a look at this foliage. It's pale, it's grown some, but it has odd spots on it. The flowering was rather sparse. We looked at the root system, didn't seem to be any sign of anything feeding on the foliage, no nematodes or anything like that. So we tried to investigate a little further and find out what might be wrong. And let me show you the extreme we're having to go to and how we found out about the problems with our geraniums. After looking this bed up and down, what we realized is that we might have a problem with our soil. In fact, it might be a fertility problem, because for 10 years we've hung hanging baskets from this trellis up here. And plants in hanging baskets usually require regular feedings through the summer, and there's a lot of leachate that comes out the bottom of it as they are watered. So we had the soil tested, and what we found out is that we had excessive levels of potassium. Now normally on a good soil test, your potassium ought to be around 250, but ours was off the charts. It stopped at 1,000, and who knows how much higher it was, but we know for sure we have 4 times the amount of potassium we need in here. Now there are several options for a home gardener if you have excessive levels of fertility in your soils, but for us we felt we needed to excavate because this is a fairly small bed. And when you have excessive potassium in soils, you can end up with salinity problems because it's applied as a fertilizer as a potassium salt, and when you get a salt buildup, what you end up with is saline soil, and plants don't thrive. It's as though there's too much salt in the water that tries to go into the roots, and you end up with plants looking desiccated and dried and generally unthrifty like our geraniums. And so we're having to go ahead and excavate all of that soil. And because it has such high fertility levels, what we're going to do is scatter this around the garden in places where we need some fill in certain places, and we're just going to treat it as a regular fertilizer. Now what can you do if you have excess amount of nutrients in your garden soil? If it's excess potassium, you could plant a plant that's potassium loving, such as tomatoes, and that might help use up some of the potassium in soil. But something you need to realize with soils is that phosphorus and potassium both pretty well stay put once you apply them. And so you don't need to apply those every year on an annual basis. And if you do, you end up with a buildup over time that can only be either carted away through excavation or grown up through the plants. Now we had a case recently in Tulsa County where there was a nitrogen excess, and usually nitrogen gets depleted every year and has to be added, but we had a homeowner who year after year put on excessive amounts of manure, and they had tomato plants that were all foliage. It looked like a jungle out there, all leaves, just a few fruits, and no tomatoes, and it was due to a nitrogen buildup in the soil. If you have a soil test done and it comes back with excess nitrogen, you can grow that out of the soil by growing plants that love nitrogen, such as sweet corn, cabbage, potatoes, or onions. They're all heavy nitrogen feeders, and over a season or two, they'll use that up and you won't have to excavate the entire garden. So that's one option for you. Now, if you haven't had your soil tested in a couple of years, you might want to do that. This is a great time to do it. The soil testing lab is not in a rush period like it is in the fall and winter when wheat farmers send in their soil samples, and in the wintertime when the other growers send their samples in. And so what you need to do is take a plastic bucket and a shovel and go around your garden, and this shows a large field where you take a few random subsamples and then gather those all together in a bucket. In a large garden area, if you'll just pull 4 or 5 subsamples by using your shovel and taking just the center slice of soil out of it down to a depth of 6 inches, mix that in a bucket, and then bring to the extension office 1 pint of dry soil. And it's enough to fill this special bag that's used to be mailed to Stillwater. And the soil has to be dry because our postal budgets will not sustain mailing mud to still water. It's a whole lot heavier, so we need dry soil, and the results will come back in about 2 weeks telling you what your nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium levels are. If you think you have an excess salt buildup, you can also pay a little extra and have a salinity sample done, and that will tell you the results. Those will be interpreted by your extension agent when they come back, and you can also correct the problem that way. But when you look at problems around your garden, whether it's in the vegetable garden or the flower garden, don't always automatically assume it's an insect or a disease problem. It might be a case of just caring a little too much for that garden over time. You might remember when 4th of July weekend it got up to 115 degrees outside, and some things around our studio garden really cooked, others survived, and we think part of the reason is we got busy and did some overhead watering. And that's something you need to remember this time of the year. Even though on Oklahoma Gardening we strongly encourage water conservation by using drip irrigation and only watering in the morning, if you're doing overhead watering, there are times in the heat of the afternoon that plants such as these impatiens and lobelia will benefit from a cooling off from an overhead watering, so you don't want to forget about that. Now, although some of our plants survived beautifully that weekend, there are others that we weren't able to keep completely cool. Let's take a look at those. It may be similar to what you're finding in your own landscape. The thing to remember is it's not permanent damage. Right here, our dogwood has the typical dogwood scorched effect. Now, this is not a disease, it's nothing that you can spray for, it's simply the effects of high temperatures. The dogwood will survive just fine, but that foliage is not going to return to a nice green color anytime this season. You just have to live with it. If you have entire branches with foliage that looks this way, if it really bothers you, you could clip some of it away and it would not be a problem. The main thing is that we keep the roots moist and that the plant itself still has healthy green foliage on it. Well, over here is a perennial that looks pretty scorched. This is Heuchera, and a lot of herbaceous perennials really got cooked that weekend. You can tell by the crispy effect that this really got cooked. Also, hostas and some other perennials had the same effect occur on them as well from the heat. But you can just clip that part away and go down into healthier foliage if it bothers you. Now, over here on the Viburnum, it had a little bit of scorching, but the nice thing about it, and this is a testimony to how tough the viburnums are, is that even though we had some scorched foliage back here, look at the new foliage that's growing out. It looks just fine. And so we want you to realize that even though we had some heat damage, plants will grow out of it. But remember, next time, when it looks like the temperature is crawling up there, you want to make sure you do a little bit of overhead watering at the peak of that hot day and help plants survive.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. You can also find more recent videos on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.